and it's a man that doesn't need an introduction, and so I'm just going to kind of just briefly go over it. But before I do it, how timely is it? We just had the Olympics in Beijing, right? And less than 48 hours now, Russia's invading Ukraine. Wasn't it nice of Russia just to wait until their ally was done with their showcasing of their propaganda? So now that now we can see the Ukraine falling on some levels. So I think that's going to be interesting to see on the China narrative, the commercialization. And our speaker, Peter Schweizer, was here about a year or so ago, and he was writing a book at the time. The book that is here now, that many of you have, is The Red-Handed. And you were alluding to a couple of things, and it was bipartisan. The Chinese don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat. They just want you to to defend them and be like the NBA and just follow, be led by the nose. So I think it's very timely, Peter, to have you here, and we love having you here. And just in case you didn't know some of his background, Peter was a Hoover Fellow at the Stanford University and worked as a speechwriter during George W. Bush's administration. I'm just going to take a couple of things out of here that are out of here. I mean, it's just books have been translated. Well, I think the most important thing, this book right here that if you haven't gotten and read yet or got signed, you can have that done with Peter afterwards. This is now a 3-time New York Times bestseller, right? And we might be going on 4, depending on how many you get today. Okay. So here's your plug, Peter. It was worth you coming right here, right now. You have written for Foreign Affairs, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and you have a master's in philosophy, is that what it is? At Oxford University, and a bachelor's of arts from George Washington University. Lives here in Tallahassee with his wife Rhonda, and is a great representative of our community. Please join me in welcoming Peter Schweizer.
Well, it's great to be here. Whenever I come to Neba, it's like a family reunion, except there's no crazy uncles, as far as I know. So it's great to be here. And in fact, Patrick's right. I spoke to you a year ago, and some of the material I talked about is the material that's now in the book. So I appreciate the fact that you honored my request to not to talk too much about it, because we certainly surprised everybody. So I want to take you back to 2015. President Xi of China was coming to the United States for a meeting with Barack Obama in the White House, and they were going to have a state dinner in the White House. But before he came to Washington, D.C., he stopped in Seattle, Washington, where there was another dinner that was held. This was at Bill Gates' house. Bill Gates, of course, the founder of Microsoft. And sitting in the room were all the tech titans that you could think of. The head of Apple, the head of Facebook, the heads of Google, were all assembled. Now, what's interesting is the attitude in which so many of these powerful, wealthy people took with President Xi. It was said that before Xi entered the room, they were all gathered and standing around, and Tim Cook, the head of Apple, was standing near some of his colleagues. And when President Xi entered the room, Tim Cook turned to his colleagues and said, "I think I just felt the ground move." Now, go forward a week later at that White House state dinner where President Xi is. Some of the same tech executives that were in Seattle were now in Washington, D.C. for the state dinner. Among them was Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. Now, Mark Zuckerberg at the time, he was there with his wife. She's Chinese American. She was pregnant. He went up to Xi, who is, of course, the dictator of China, and he asked him, "President Xi, would you provide a name for my child?" The leader, President Xi, responded, "No, that's too great a responsibility." Even President Xi saw this as sort of an awkward, grasping moment. Let me give you a couple of other stories to explain to what I'm getting at. About 8 months after that meeting, Mark Zuckerberg was at his headquarters in Facebook in California, and the chief propagandist for the Chinese Communist Party showed up and wanted a tour. So Zuckerberg gave him a tour of the campus, then brought him back to his CEO office, and he had him sit in his chair, at which point the propagandist looked over at his desk and saw a familiar-looking book. And the propagandist picked up the copy, And he recognized it as a book that he actually had put together. It was the collected speeches of President Xi of China. And he asked Mark Zuckerberg, why do you have this book on your desk? And Zuckerberg said, well, I'm reading the book, and I bought copies for all of my senior executives at Facebook so we can all understand better socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, what exactly is going on here? What would prompt somebody so wealthy and powerful as Mark Zuckerberg to act in what I would regard as such a groveling manner toward a brutal dictator who is leading the world's largest country? And the answer is a very specific concept that China has operated under, and it's called elite capture. And elite capture, you have to credit Beijing with, is a brilliant strategy. The strategy basically says, look, we view the United States as our chief rival, maybe even our chief enemy, and we know we're going to have a hard time going head-to-head with such a dynamic economy, not to mention a country that has the most powerful military in the world. So rather than going head-to-head with the United States, we're going to buy off elements of their leadership, and we're going to effectively lobotomize them. And we want these leaders to essentially look the other way, or in some cases even aid and abet us in our competition against the United States. Now, it's important to point out here, what they're looking for from these elites is not robotic behavior. They're not expecting them to imitate everything they say and everything they do. What they're looking for, loosely translated into the English, is what they call big help with a little bad mouth. And what they basically mean is, it's okay if our political leaders or if our corporate leaders occasionally bring up the Uyghurs and the genocide that's taking place there, or bring up human rights violations, or bring up the threats to Taiwan, or bring up the myriad of other problems and challenges that China presents. That's okay, that's little bad mouth. As long as they are delivering on what matters most to us, which is unfettered access to capital in the United States and unfettered access to our technology, they are quite happy to allow those political leaders or corporate leaders to criticize them. So let me give you a couple of examples. I know we always have such a great Q&A session here at Neba. So let me just bring up a couple of examples. I'm going to talk a little bit about Washington, D.C., and it's important to emphasize this is a problem on both sides of the political aisle. This is not exclusive to one political party. It's not about red, it's not about blue, it's about green, it's about money. Then I want to talk a little bit about Wall Street, and then I'll return to Silicon Valley and we'll have some questions and answers. So let's talk about Washington, D.C. How dire is this situation as far as elite capture is concerned? Well, let me talk about three of the most powerful people in Washington, and there are many others below them. But I want to talk about Joe Biden, I want to talk about Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, and I want to talk about Nancy Pelosi, the current Speaker of the House. Let's begin with the Biden family, and I've talked to you about this before, and I've written about this before. But what we essentially have done over the last 18 months to research this book is go through the Hunter Biden laptop and go through another email collection of one of Hunter Biden's business partners, a guy named Bevan Cooney, to really answer two fundamental questions that are vitally important. Everybody now acknowledges that the Bidens had commercial deals in China, and they didn't look like deals that were, let's just say, deserved based on their merits. But the questions I want to answer is, how much money are we actually talking about? And second of all, who actually made those deals happen in China? That's pretty important, right? In other words, as my kids would say, who made it rain for the Bidens in China? And what we found is pretty simple. The deals that we know of, so this is kind of a bare minimum, is that the Bidens received some $31 million from a series of 5 deals in China. All of those deals, and I can talk in detail if you want in the Q&A session, all of those deals indicate nothing of any tangible professional value that the Biden family provided in return. There's no discernible service or product that they contributed to this. It's $31 million that they received. But even more troubling, we looked at who are the businessmen that made this happen in China. And we found that all 4 of them, and we named them in the book, and again I can talk about it in greater detail in Q&A, All four of the businessmen that made these deals happen have ties to the highest levels of Chinese intelligence, meaning the vice minister for state security is in charge of foreign intelligence recruitment, meaning the family of the former minister of state security who runs the entire spy apparatus. In other words, these were not random businessmen that decided haphazardly they were going to go into business with the Bidens. So it's very clear in my mind, and I think by any objective standard, there was a concerted effort by Beijing to engage in elite capture with the Biden family. And I would contend that they've been very successful at doing that. Now, before all the Biden critics get all excited and say the Republicans have got their act together, let's switch to Mitch McConnell, who is the Senate leader for the Republicans, and if the Republicans retake the House, will become the Senate Majority Leader in the U.S. Senate. Mitch McConnell is married to Elaine Chao, who is the Transportation Secretary in the Trump administration, and her family has a business called Foremost Shipping that has benefited enormously to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars from the good faith and largesse of the Chinese government. And it started back in the early 1990s. In 1993, Mitch McConnell and Elaine Chao got married, and effectively their honeymoon was a trip that Mitch McConnell took with Elaine Chao and his father-in-law to Beijing, China. Now, for those of us like me who are old enough to remember, 1993 was a very difficult time for China because Tiananmen Square had happened 4 years earlier. Literally 10,000 civilians had been killed by the Chinese military. They had actually run tanks over people. It was a horrific affair, and for good reason. Political leaders in the United States were not going to China. Mitch McConnell was only the second United States senator to visit Beijing, China, but he wasn't there to meet with Chinese officials. He and his family, his in-laws, were there as guests of the Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation. And they struck a very simple, profitable bargain. The Chinese Shipbuilding Corporation said, we want to be in business with the McConnell Chao family, so we'll tell you what, those big cargo ships that you buy and that you ship goods all around the world in, we'll build all of those for you. And on top of that, we'll not only build them, we will get Chinese state banks to finance the construction for you. So you won't even have to effectively do that yourself, we will do it for you. On top of that, you're going to need crews to man these vessels, right? That's what makes them go. We'll help you get the crews. And then finally, we've got a lot of state-owned companies that have a lot of goods they're trying to export. We'll sign up a bunch of contracts for you and make you very profitable. And that's indeed what they've done, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. So Mitch McConnell is in a situation today where to take a position, a hard line on something related to China, the family business could be and would be destroyed overnight. And this leverage that Beijing has over Mitch McConnell is largely his and his family's doing. They voluntarily struck this relationship with Beijing. Now let me switch over to the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi actually historically was very critical of China. Back in the early 1990s, remember we had talked about Tiananmen Square? Well, Nancy Pelosi had visited there as a congresswoman, and she actually took a banner criticizing Beijing for its human rights policy and unfurled it on Tiananmen Square. Of course, the Chinese police didn't like that. They confiscated the banner. They roughed her up. But it was a very courageous thing for her to do. Unfortunately, she has changed substantially since that time. And it really began in the late 2000s when her husband and her son began seeking and securing deals in mainland China. So you have a circumstance today where Nancy Pelosi will say, yes, Beijing is committing genocide. Yes, Beijing is a threat to Taiwan, but we have no alternative but to engage with them and negotiate with them and find common ground because she believes that the stakes are so high. So that is the lay of the land in Washington, D.C. I could give you a bunch of other names. I could give you the names of 23 Republicans and Democrats, former senators and U.S. congressmen who are registered lobbyists, not just for Chinese companies, but for Chinese military and intelligence-linked companies. I could talk about the myriad of other members of Congress that have commercial ties with China. The bottom line is it is a massive problem, and it's a bipartisan problem, and they are effectively lobotomizing our leadership, because you will notice that whatever China seems to do, there's very little response from our political leadership. Now let me just talk about Wall Street for a little bit. If you look at the biggest firms on Wall Street, BlackRock, Blackstone, they are all linked at the hip with China. Not only do they do business in China, they actually invest in Chinese military companies. Those military companies are, of course, aiming their weapons and their systems at us. So Blackstone, for example, one of the biggest private equity firms in the world, is a major stakeholder in JD Logistics. What does this company do? It is revamping the entire infrastructure for the Chinese Air Force, so the Chinese Air Force can more effectively project its power into the Pacific. Well, where do you think those planes and those missiles and those ships are going to be directed? At the United States, at our servicemen and women. Or take a company like BlackRock, the largest investment firm in the world. BlackRock has $10 trillion, that's with a T, in assets under management. That's about half the size of the entire gross domestic product of the United States. They have all kinds of deals with China. And while Larry Fink, the leader of BlackRock, is very critical of the United States and what he sees as problems in our country, he has nothing but nice things to say about China, because he is interested in getting greater into that market. Let me finally talk about a company called Bridgewater Associates, you may never heard of, may not have heard of. It's headed by a guy named Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio is probably one of the most important influencers on Wall Street. He is also, in my mind, one of the most appalling individuals for making excuses for what China does. There are lots of examples in the book. I'll just give you one. Ray Dalio wrote a book in 2016 called Principles, which is an ironic title based on what I'm about to tell you. But the book Principles, he talks about a Chinese leader named Wang Sean, and how he's known him as a good friend, and that this man, in a sense, has helped him unlock the keys to the universe. That's actually what he says. I mean, so it's this over-the-top discussion, almost a quasi-religious experience, and he says that Wang Sean has been a remarkable force for good on the world stage for decades. So I decided to figure out, well, who is this guy Wang Sean? I mean, what warrants such praise from a guy who's obviously very smart? And it turns out that Wang Sean is the second most powerful man in China. He is President Xi's enforcer. So The Economist magazine, some of you may read it, The Economist magazine calls Wang Sean the most feared man in China, because if you get arrested, if you get tortured, if you get thrown into jail, it's Wang Sean who is probably behind it. So what would prompt an obviously knowledgeable man like Ray Dalio, who's already worth $20 billion, to say such outrageous things? Well, after he wrote that book, after he said other nice things about China, his company became the first hedge fund to be able to offer its products in China to the average Chinese citizen. So he's making a lot of money for selling his soul. So let me finally just talk about Silicon Valley, just briefly. In some ways, this may be the scariest element of all of this. All the biggest tech firms in Silicon Valley are actively, eagerly doing deals with China, and they are doing deals with China that not only help the Chinese economy, but help the Chinese military. So there's a field of technological research called artificial intelligence. You're probably familiar with it, you've heard about it. This is kind of the central component of the race for technology, because this is going to guide not just military systems, it's going to guide computer systems, supply chains, everything. It is the holy grail of the technology race. And President Xi of China has said, whoever wins the race in artificial intelligence is going to seize the commanding heights in the technological war. And that's the word he uses, technological war. So that's how Xi views it. Now, we've got the best and brightest companies in the world. We've got the best engineers in the world. But here's the problem. Microsoft and Google both sponsor with financial support, but also with personnel, 3 research laboratories in China, cutting-edge research laboratories in China that are doing work on artificial intelligence. And guess what? Each and every one of those labs is known. You can research it, find the names in my book, you can research it. Each one is known to be directly working with the Chinese military. So you've got 2 of America's premier companies, Microsoft and Google, that are actually aiding and abetting China in its technological race with us. They call it a war, not a race. And they are determined to win that race, and I would argue they're going to win the race as long as we allow our companies to subsidize them and help them in the competition. Let me give you just another example of the sort of thing that's going on, the negligent, destructive behavior by these technology elites. In 2016, Google and Facebook, meaning Mark Zuckerberg, decided that they were going to construct a massive underwater cable linking Hong Kong with San Francisco. And they hired a Chinese military contractor to build this massive cable. What could go wrong, right? And they begin constructing this thing, they keep working on this thing, and finally by 2019, the FBI and the Department of Justice says, you can't complete this project, because in the words of the FBI, this project would create, quote, unprecedented opportunities for the Chinese government to spy on Americans. Now, let me ask you a question. I'm not really big on technology, but does anybody in the room honestly believe that that came as a surprise to the founders of Google or Facebook? That somehow some guys at the FBI figured out this would create unprecedented spying opportunities, and Google and Facebook were shocked that it could be used this way? Heck no. Heck no. They knew that that would be a consequence and a byproduct of it. The problem is they didn't care. They were more concerned in completing their project, the vision for what they want to do with their companies, than they were with the national security interests of the United States. And that, in sum, is what I would say is the problem. Political figures on both sides of the aisle, a lot of the biggest firms on Wall Street, a lot of the biggest firms in the tech world view themselves more as autonomous individuals that have sort of a global citizenry and are less wedded and moored to the fact that they are Americans, and seem to have very little concern for the destructive behavior that they're engaging in. The reason I wrote the book is I wanted to call them out, I want to shame them, and I think there are other things that we need to consider doing to correct the problem. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I would love to take any questions. Catherine is going to be with a microphone. All right,
thank you, Peter. Thank you. One housekeeping, I'm going to ask the first question, but just one housekeeping item. Only members get to ask questions. And before I forget, after we're done, Peter will be signing books. But he does have an interview that he has to get to, so while you're getting your signature, you know, his John Hancock, would you just please keep the conversation short and brief so everyone can get their signature from Peter. My question with you, Peter, is kind of twofold. Canada is kind of, with the truckers, doesn't really look like a democracy. And also Taiwan, you know, with the computer, you know, the microprocessors. With this red-handed and lobotomy of leadership here, how emboldened do you think that the Chinese are, you know, in taking maybe military action?
Great questions. Those are both great questions. So one of the chapters I have in the book is China's courting of political dynasties, and there's half the chapter is on the Bush family in the United States and their long ties to Beijing and what that means. The other chapter, the other section of that chapter is on the Trudeau family of Canada. And what's very interesting is that Justin Trudeau, and his father, of course, was prime minister earlier, have very close financial ties to China. And there's this over-the-top interview that Justin Trudeau gave in 2012. He was asked, he was a member of parliament at the time, he was asked by somebody, what foreign government, other than Canada, what foreign government do you most admire? Now, Justin Trudeau did not mention the United States. He did not mention the UK. He did not mention Germany. The list goes on and on. He mentioned China. And he said, I have to say, there's a lot of attraction I have. These are his words. There's a lot of attraction I have to the quote-unquote basic dictatorship that China enjoys. And he's not alone in this, by the way. What he cites is the fact that dictatorships are efficient. They just get stuff done. Well, of course, if you're trampling on people's civil rights and property rights, yeah, you can get a lot of stuff done. But this is another motivating factor. And I think that, you know, when you look at Justin Trudeau, in that moment when he gave that interview in 2012, and he's never said I made a mistake or I was wrong, it does show sort of this undercurrent among some political leaders and some corporate types. They like the fact that representative democracy that we have, it's messy, it's sloppy, you can appeal things, you can go to court, you can veto legislation. I mean, there are all kinds of things you can do, checks and balances, so things move slowly. They are used to getting things done, they have ambitious agendas, and they find attraction to the sorts of things that are going on. So the events in Canada, I think, are appalling, but I do think Justin Trudeau's history and comments about China offer some insight. As far as their military aggression is concerned, I think it's a huge problem. I think that, you know, to quote Winston Churchill, I don't think China wants war, they want the fruits of war. So I think they're hoping to intimidate enough to essentially co-opt and gain control of China. But if you look at what they're accomplishing culturally in countries like the United States, the entire movie industry in the United States now will not do a film where the bad guys are Chinese. They remade, remember that ridiculous movie in the 80s, Red Dawn? Mm-hmm. I love that movie, I was like in high school. They remade that. Originally, the script called for it to be a Chinese invasion, and Warner Bros. Said, no, we can't do that. We're trying to sell films in China, they'll get mad. So they made it a North Korean invasion, which, you know, North Korea is invading the United States, that's realistic. But the point is that, and there have been books and articles written about this, China will not do a film on the Dalai Lama anymore. They used to do it, Richard Gere was behind it. Richard Gere cannot get a job in Hollywood anymore. And part of the reason is he has been critical of China and their actions in Tibet. So I would argue China is already starting to accomplish some very powerful things culturally in this United States. Whether it's the NBA, whether it's Hollywood or Wall Street, they will not criticize this government for the sort of horrific things that they're doing. And so that's what I think they want. They want the fruits of war, they don't want war itself. Yes, Catherine over there. Barney.
Yes, Peter, thanks for coming here again and exposing and uncovering all of these facts. So what's the solution? Because the legacy media, the mainstream media, is not going to really cover this. I mean, I saw you on Tucker Carlson. Thank you for being there. But how are we going to get this message out, besides you being on the bestseller list? How can we really get this done so that we expose our leadership that has been compromised?
It's a great question. And the challenge is it becomes kind of a partisan issue in a couple of ways. One is there are people who want to use it as a cudgel. So for example, there are people who want to use it as a cudgel against Joe Biden, but they don't want to deal with Mitch McConnell and his ties, or vice versa. That's part of the problem. The other part of the problem when it comes to the legacy media, and there's, again, been material written on this, who owns ABC News? Disney, right? Who owns NBC News? Comcast. All of these corporate media accounts are owned by large corporations who are looking to do business where? In China. You know, is Disney, who wants to open more theme parks, who wants to distribute its films in China, are they really going to do a series exposing Chinese penetration in the United States? Of course not. The CEO will kill that in a minute. So we're not going to get movement from the media. What we are, I think, seeing, and I get accused of being overly optimistic, what we are seeing, I think, honestly, is just the beginnings of a movement on this on a bipartisan basis. So the book's been out for 3 weeks. We've been #1 on the New York Times list for 3 weeks in a row. I've never had anything like it, and I wish I could say it was my genius planning. It wasn't. I just think it's an organic reflection of the fact that the American people see this going on. And by the way, it's really on a bipartisan basis. There's a guy that has a book out right now that came out after mine, a guy named Isaac Stonefish. He's a former Washington Post reporter. He's pretty left-wing. The book is very similar in theme to what I'm talking about. So I talk in the concluding chapter of the book. There are people on both sides of the aisle that are prepared to do something about this. Now, these names are going to upset at least half the people in this room. But I think we have to get past that. And it doesn't mean you have to like everything these people are doing. But you can look at Donald Trump has been good on China. So has Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate. Schumer's been very, very good on China. There are 3 senators in the Democrats in the U.S. Senate that I name in the book. There are 3 Republicans. They've all been good. And the point we have to do is get past the partisan squabbling and come to a unified consensus on this. It's going to be very hard. China doesn't mind this issue being discussed as long as we're not unified. So getting to that unity part, I think, is the difficult part. Where's Catherine?
Peter, can you give us some insight as to what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine, and where the money flow is in that arena?
Yeah, the money flow is interesting and hard to trace. I mean, Ukraine is a difficult circumstance because there's a long history there. And I will talk to people that I know that are Russian that will say, well, Ukraine's been part of Russia for 600 years until the 20th century. So they belong to us. And my response to them is, well, did you actually consult the Ukrainians on that? Which they don't. I think that what Putin is not in a great position domestically in his country. The economy has not been doing well. They have really struggled. There's been an uptick in energy prices, which they like because that's a huge portion of their hard currency. I think a lot of what you're seeing in Ukraine is Putin trying to enhance his reputation domestically and politically. And the way you have to deal with him is firmly. And I think the mistake I would say that the Biden administration made is they should have said at the beginning, if you take this action, here is exactly what is going to happen to you. And it should have been a long list of sanctions, a long list of restrictions on everything from their energy industry to their banking sector, et cetera. And I think he also should have said, if you invade Ukraine, we are going to arm Ukrainians and support them in the fight for their country. We don't need to send any troops there. That's not our fight. But we will help the Ukrainians fight for their country. And I think if you were clear cut about it that way, Putin probably would have had a second thought. As to the money part, Ukraine annually shows up as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Part of the problem is it does not have a great system of governance. The other problem is it has a lot of natural resources, so there's a lot of money to be made. Obviously, people are familiar with Hunter Biden and the fact that he was on Ukrainian energy, but it goes deeper than that. There are a lot of consultants, a lot of people in Washington that are on the take, and there are a lot of people in Washington that are working for Gazprom and these large Russian companies. I think one of the solutions to the China issue and to issues like Russia and this sort of foreign influence that's working its way into our country is to ban lobbying on behalf of foreign countries and foreign governments. And here's the reason I say that. I actually believe lobbying has a valuable role to play. Our Constitution guarantees us the right to petition our government. And that's effectively what lobbying means. But the last time I checked, the Constitution is for American citizens. It's not for foreign governments, and it's not for foreign corporations, and it's not for foreign military-linked corporations. So we need to ban the pernicious foreign influence of money because you've got so many people that are now hired guns for foreign entities. John Boehner, who is the Republican Speaker of the House, when he left, he went to join a lobbying firm that, among other things, is the lobbyist for the Chinese government, the actual Chinese government. And they have partners in the firm that are high-ranking members of the Chinese Communist Party. What is that about? That should be banned. You should not be allowed to engage in that kind of behavior. And that, I think, would help a little bit. It wouldn't solve the very complex problems in Ukraine, but it would at least eliminate some of the pernicious foreign influence that I think is running through our capital. Yeah.
You know, everything seems to be lit up pretty well if you look at through a global lens, you know, to follow the money. So with that said, and he asked about solutions, how do you see, Peter, that like George Soros, the dark one, whatever, can you speak a little bit candor about the press and Soros' influence and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Soros is somebody who, you know, works very aggressively for agenda he supports. I don't support it. I feel like within the bounds of the law, he has the right to advocate on those positions. The challenge is if you're sort of masking what you're trying to do. And in the case of Soros, one of the reasons we have a lot of prosecutors around the country right now who, you know, you can be all for some reform of the criminal justice system, feeling like, you know, some people have got, you know, unfair treatment, you know, nonviolent drug offenders. If you feel like, I completely understand that and have that conversation. The problem is when you have in Los Angeles and New York these prosecutors that are allowing violent offenders to be released with no bail, and that's being supported by prosecutors in these cities who were backed. 90% of their fundraising for their political campaigns came from George Soros. You have a serious problem. So I don't favor banning that because I think you need to allow people, but there needs to be greater transparency. And I think especially on local criminal justice elections, district attorneys, etc., there needs to be limits to the amount of support that you can provide, especially if you don't even live there. I mean, if you're pouring $1 million into the San Francisco DA's race, and you don't even live in San Francisco, that's kind of problematic.
Ion Sancho, our former supervisor of elections, gave a demonstration showing how the Dominion machines could have been used to change the results of election. And now that I've heard you talk about how deeply embedded the technology community is into everything in the world, how do you think we will ever have honest elections again? Because I just don't see what Ion did not happening ever again, despite all the changes in the laws.
Yeah, I'm a big believer, and people are in the office. Catherine will support me on this, and Faith Brumers, who's here, will back me up on this. I'm probably not the person to ask technology questions about, because I'm pretty tried and true, but I have never understood the argument that we should have ballotless elections, where everything is just recorded electronically. And I know probably some very smart people will come to me and say, no, there's ways you can ensure. And I get that, but to me, I like paper physical ballots, because if you need to recount something, there's actually something physical, a stack that you can go to. So that's where I come to. I think that election fraud is a serious issue and it needs to be addressed, but I also plead with everybody, you cannot lose faith in the system. What you need to do is you need to fight for ballot integrity, you need to fight for honesty in our elections. We need to have more reforms. I think in Florida we've done some terrific things here to make them more credible, but do not lose faith in the electoral system. That's what they want us to do. That's what they want us to do, to say we're not really any different than China, we're not really any different than Russia, the people don't pick their leaders. If it comes to that point in day, what's the point of even getting out of bed as far as I'm concerned? So don't lose faith in it, but keep fighting for these common sense reforms. And I think there's been some very good successes here in Georgia and Wisconsin in that direction.
This will be the last one.
Okay, this will be the last question,
Cool.
sorry.
Listen to you talk about both sides, you know, it's not red, it's not blue, it's green, you've got to follow the money. Would you say that a step in the right direction would be to start to elect people that believe in term limits? Because if Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi could stay up there, clearly they're being influenced long term. And if the Chinese government and other governments knew that they couldn't be influenced, they never know who's coming up. I mean, yes, they'll try, but it's a lot easier to influence somebody that's been there for 20, 30 plus years, you know, and hold them accountable, you know, with money and possibly family ties and stuff like that. It seems to me like one of the most basic solutions we could do is vote for term limits.
I think term limits are a great idea. I've supported them for years for a variety of reasons, and this would be another argument in favor of it. Look, China likes long-term relationships and building long-term relationships. It simplifies their life. And I think the problem is the longer you stay in office, it doesn't matter who you are, what your political views are, how strong your moral fortitude is. The temptations start to mount once you're there. One of the friends I worked on a book with him was a guy named Bobby Jindal. He was the governor of Louisiana. Before that, he was a member of Congress for 3 terms. And he said to me, look, when you first get to Washington, he said, I remember when I first started having these meetings, you'd go into this meeting and there'd be a line of lobbyists there and they'd be handing you a check for your campaign and they'd be wanting a favor. And he said, when you get there that first day, I was just disgusted. I just wanted to take a shower. I thought, what am I doing here? He said, this place is a cesspool. He says, well, you keep doing that and that cesspool turns into a hot tub. It just becomes the new normal. It becomes familiar to it. Oh, it's not so bad. I was just naive before. Or, oh no, okay, this is bad, but I'm doing good things, so it's okay to make these compromises. So term limits are a way of dealing, in my mind, with that corruptive, corrosive power that having power has on people. And my view is, it doesn't matter what your political views are, nobody is irreplaceable. Our system is predicated on the idea that there are good people out there that can run. If you're a diehard Donald Trump person, I hate to break it to you, there are other people that could be president and could be effective in advancing your ideas as well. If you're a diehard Nancy Pelosi fan, guess what? There are other people that are going to advance the ideas just as well that you support as Speaker of the House. It's not predicated on these individual people. They want you to think that. But the entire basis of our system is predicated on the notion that there are good people that can rise up, that we can elect, and that can perform those services for us. So I agree with you. Thank you, everybody. Great to see everybody.